Hello, everyone. Welcome to Singing the Message. This is the video that I started this summer in which I look at some of the songs that we sang on Sundays and connect them to the lessons and to the message of the sermon. And a reminder that we sing the message of the good news of Jesus in our songs and hear the message sometimes more clearly through the songs than we do through the scriptures or the sermon, and that's okay. But we have some really great songs in this month of August because our gospel is focusing on John chapter 6, which is known as the bread of life discourse of Jesus. Jesus talks about being the bread of life, and we have a lot of bread hymns. You can imagine why for Holy Communion, but also that connect to that idea of Jesus as the bread of life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This video is from Sunday, August 4th. So the first Sunday in August. And the scriptures that were assigned for the day were Exodus 16, verses 2 to 4 and 9 to 15. The psalm was Psalm 78, verses 23 to 29. The second reading was Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 16. And the gospel is John 6, verses 24 through 35. And I did preach a lot on this reading from John, and will be doing that throughout the month of August. But I looked back also at the reading from Exodus, which is the story of God raining down manna, because it is referenced in the discussion between Jesus and the crowd in John 6. So it's the story of God's people in the wilderness complaining that there's no food, and then God telling Moses to tell the people to look out in the morning and there would be food for them to eat. A dew came down upon the grass, and when it had grass in the wilderness, no, dew came down on the ground, and when the dew had kind of melted away, there was a layer of some flaky stuff, and that was manna. So both of those were referenced in the sermon and also in some of our hymns. So the first hymn that we had for the day was How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds. Now, when you first hear the title, you don't necessarily think that it is connected to the theme for the day, but there is a verse in here, and it says, it's verse 2. It makes the wounded, we're talking about the name of Jesus, it makes the wounded spirit whole and calms the heart's unrest. 'Tis manna to the hungry soul and to the weary rest. So in this hymn, it makes reference to the idea of just like the manna when the wilderness for God's people, just as that was the thing that nourished them. The name of Jesus is like manna for the hungry soul. It is that which nourishes us. And that is actually a theme. The hymn, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds, it makes a lot of references to what the name of Jesus does for us. In verse 1, it soothes our sorrows, it heals our wounds, drives away our fear. I already mentioned verse 2, the rock on which I build my shield and hiding place, so it gives me a strength. My never-failing treasury, filled with boundless stores of grace. The idea being, it's kind of like a specific. When I ask people questions about God, like, what does God provide for us? Everything. Okay, yeah, okay, and this talks about how the name of Jesus gives us everything, but it's specific to what the everything means, what it does for every aspect of our lives. And I talked about that a little bit in the sermon, how Jesus is trying to move the people into the idea of relationship with Jesus because he provides everything for their lives and move them away from the idea of the bread. Jesus fed the 5,000 and he provided bread that nourishes the body. But let's try to move the conversation and the understanding from nourishing the body to nourishing every aspect of our being, every part of our being. And that's what Jesus kind of trying to get at throughout the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. And this hymn actually gets at it really good, even though it has the teeny tiny little reference to manna, and yet the whole of the hymn is really talking about the name of Jesus and what it does for the whole of our lives. And then the next hymn that we sang after the sermon was What Feast of Love. Now, I hope that that sounded a little bit familiar, and it might have thrown you off a little bit, because the tune was a familiar tune that we might associate more with a Christmas song. The tune has a name, and it's called Greensleeves. So that tune goes with the hymn, What Child Is This? So usually we sing What Child Is This to this hymn tune, but the hymn, What Feast of Love, also uses the same hymn tune. And so hopefully you felt like a little bit of a Christmas we were in August instead of July feeling. You're like, oh, these are different words, but I know that there's a hymn that I sing with this that's different. And it was What Child Is This? But What Feast of Love, and it is in the communion section of our hymnal. It talks about, and it is talking about communion. In the second half of the first verse, it says, This is Christ the King, the bread come down from heaven. So Jesus talks about that in that particular passage that we had this past Sunday. Jesus is the bread come down from heaven. Oh, taste and see and sing how sweet the manna given. Again, a reference to manna, that which nourished God's people in the wilderness is Jesus now nourishing ourselves. But when we say at the beginning, the song begins, What feast of love is offered here? What banquet come from heaven? This is why this is a communion hymn, because it is talking about what we are doing and what are we receiving when we celebrate Holy Communion together. What food of everlasting life, what gracious gift is given. And so I said in my sermon 2 weeks ago that John chapter 6 is kind of like John's understanding of Holy Communion, and what Jesus gives us through Holy Communion, because there is no Last Supper account in John's Gospel. So we can very easily tie together Jesus as the bread of heaven and the bread that we receive at Holy Communion. I haven't necessarily done that yet in my sermons, because my sermon does go out to people who may not be receiving communion on a weekly basis like we do at Lord of Life. But the idea is still there, that Jesus is basically as necessary to our spirit and our whole lives as bread is to, or bread was one of the main staples. Most cultures have some form of bread that they eat on a pretty regular basis that sustains life. So that's why the image of bread is so helpful in thinking about Jesus. Bread is the staple for life. Jesus is the staple for life as well. So What Feast of Love was the hymn of the day, and it very much pointed to what Jesus, what it is that we are receiving and what it is that we experience through Holy Communion by receiving Jesus, Christ the King, in this in the hymn, of course, as the bread of heaven, as the manna that comes to us. So very, very good hymn. We don't get this one very often, but it's a very good communion hymn. And then our final hymn that we sang was one that might not have been as familiar to folks, but it was "By Your Hand You Feed Your People." And by your hand you feed your people. When I hear that, it reminds me of what I said in the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in John's Gospel, that Jesus is the one who specifically feeds the people. And I think that that's the image that's so important for the whole of John chapter 6. Jesus is trying to convey that he is the one who provides for his people, because there's a relationship there. He wants to establish a relationship. He wants us to know there's a relationship there. And so it says, by your hand you feed your people, food of angels, heaven's bread. Jesus talks about the bread of heaven as he's talking with the crowds. For these gifts we did not labor, by your grace we have been fed. So grace is such an important word in the Lutheran faith that I don't use quite enough. And it's important. I think lots of Christian denominations use it. But I know we talk about it a lot in Lutheran circles. All of this is a gracious gift. God sending Jesus into the world, Jesus inviting us into relationship, Jesus providing for us what we cannot provide for ourselves. This isn't anything that we labor for. All of this, the relationship with God, all of that which sustains us, our faith, our lives, our hope, all that sustains us for our everyday life is a gift that has been given to us through Jesus and through his death and resurrection. And the chorus, the refrain on this is, Christ's own body, blessed and broken, cup overflowing, life outpoured. So again, this abundance of God's grace has come to us, given as a living token of your world, redeemed, restored. And of course, that abundance of grace is poured out for the purpose of redeeming and restoring God's creation, whether it be relationship between humanity and God, relationship between humanity and each other, and certainly the relationship between humanity and the rest of God's good creation. The hymn is beautiful. I encourage you to look at it. It's in your ELW number 469. Again, some wonderful imagery for the idea of what God providing for us, satisfying what we need most in our lives. So I've gone a little bit longer than I usually intended, but good hymns. Thanks to Tim for choosing them. And I encourage you to pay attention to your hymns and sing them, or at least read along the words in worship, even if you don't feel comfortable singing out, because these hymns have such an important message, and sometimes they speak the gospel more powerfully to us than the sermon or the scriptures. So thank you for watching, and God bless.